This week in wrestling history, 31 years ago this week, on October 14th, 1989, WWE held its 5th annual King of the Ring tournament, which actually started back in 1985. It was a house show gimmick to sell more tickets long before it was converted into a pay-per-view. Tito Santana beat his former Strikeforce partner Rick Martel in the finals to become king. 3 years in a row, they ran the Providence Civic Center in Rhode Island for this show. If they were using it as a gimmick to sell tickets, well, it wasn't working anymore. The first show they did there sold over 12,000 tickets. By the time they got to the show in '89, they had sold 4,500. Although, to be fair, that was the B team. The A team was running a matinee show that same day in Philadelphia with the Ultimate Warrior, Andre the Giant, Roddy Piper, Jake the Snake, Demolition. That show had 15,000 fans. 28 years ago this week, on October 12, 1992, a pivotal day in WWE history because at a TV taping in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada, Bret the Hitman Hart defeated Nature Boy Ric Flair to win his first of 5 WWE World Championships in a match that was never televised, although it did make it onto the Smack'em Whack'em Coliseum video release. I got that up in my closet over here. I don't know if it's on the network. The network has a whole bunch of Coliseum videos. I'm pretty sure it should be on there, but they don't have every Coliseum video, so I can't be 100% sure about that. But it never aired on TV, oddly enough. I'm sure I must have known about this title change first from the syndicated shows that I was watching at the time, Superstars, Wrestling Challenge. I'm sure they broke in probably that first weekend with some kind of news update. My first actual memory, though, of learning that Bret won the title was when my issue of WWF Magazine arrived in the mail. But the magazines usually were on like a month delay, so I'm sure I heard about it on TV first. And it was shocking. It was shocking because, yes, Bret had been the Intercontinental Champion, but this was still the era of Hulk Hogan, even though he wasn't in the company at the time. It was the era of Hulk Hogan and the Macho Man and Ric Flair and the Undertaker, right? And all these big, colorful guys as the champion. And the idea of Bret Hart being the WWF champion was still, pretty crazy. Now, Ric Flair had just regained the title from Randy Savage in a match the month before that was so bad the first time. And maybe it wasn't even that bad, but it was not what Vince McMahon wanted. It was such a disappointment to him that an angry Vince McMahon sent them back out to retape it later on that same night. He sent Bobby Heenan out to the ring during the first match to give the cutthroat sign. And then they ended the match, they went to the back, and Vince basically said, look, this is not what I wanted. You're not doing what I told you to do. I guess Macho wasn't selling the knee injury enough, and whatever it was. Eventually they came back out, they wrestled another 25 minutes, and Flair pinned Savage. Savage passed out in the figure 4 leg lock, he pinned him, and Ric Flair won the belt back. Now fast forward a few weeks, Flair is wrestling the Ultimate Warrior. Lucky him, right? He's on this loop have matches with the Ultimate Warrior, and they're wrestling in Phoenix a few days before he dropped the belt to Bret in Saskatoon. Now, according to Flair in his book, Warrior gave him a suplex in this match, and it messed him up. It messed him up because he messed up the suplex, and Flair landed on his head. And what happened is it dislodged a chip in his inner ear. And it threw off his balance, his equilibrium. It was just all screwed. Charles Barkley was sitting in the front row for the match. And I guess Flair wanted to show off for Sir Charles. And so he had the Warrior shoot him into the corner. He kept wrestling. He had the Warrior shoot him into the corner. He was going to do his classic Flair flip in the corner, the upside down bump. But he missed. He missed the turnbuckle and he flew out to the floor. And he went to stand up. He couldn't stand up. He fell back down again. He had no idea what was going on. He said he thought he was having a stroke. So the match was stopped, and he knew that he had to drop... The company knew that he had to drop the belt as soon as possible. Bret has in the past talked about the company having a list, or Vince McMahon having a list, of 5 names that they were considering putting the championship on. But all 5 of those names have never been revealed. Bret was obviously one of them. Tito Santana, believe it or not, was said to be another. I would have to assume who are the other 3 names? Just me guessing here. I would think Undertaker would have been on that list, although he was injured at the time. They weren't even sure he'd be able to make it in time to be on the Survivor Series card, which he was. So if they knew he was hurt, maybe Undertaker wasn't on the list. But he would have been a natural babyface, right, to put the belt on. Randy Savage? I don't know. They just took the belt off of him. I don't know if they would have wanted to put the belt right back on. Ultimate Warrior was on his way out. It's just a matter of how far in advance did the company know that they were getting rid of this guy. You know, not for nothing. If Tito was on that list, I don't see why the Big Boss Man would not have been considered. Boss Man was very popular back then. If Tito Santana was being considered for WWE Champion, then absolutely the Big Boss Man should have been considered for that spot as well. But on the Tito stuff, Bruce Prichard, on his podcast, had this to say. He said, considering that the only people discussing it were Vince, Pat, and myself at the time, yeah, Tito's name was brought up as someone possible because when you look at the roster, we were looking for someone that was dependable and someone that the audience knew and respected that you can look at and say, okay, here's your new champion. Tito's name was discussed, and Bret got the nod coming off of a European tour and the incredible response that he had received over there. But to say that Tito's name was discussed, absolutely it was. Tito Santana gave an interview to WrestleZone just last month, talk about great timing, and this was brought up, and he said that before the switch to Bret, he had wrestled The Undertaker in a match in Spain, and he beat him. And he thinks that that may have been when the company was starting to kind of prepare him to possibly be the world champion. I know that match very well. It was Barcelona. He hit Undertaker in the face with an urn and kind of fell down on top of him. And they had this great wide shot, and they were doing a slow, like, panning back as the referee went to count the 3. And they had a packed crowd there in Barcelona. And I'm sure Tito was probably the number 1 guy. Everybody there loved Tito that night. And he was the first guy, I think, to officially pin The Undertaker in a singles match. And the place just came unglued for the finish. You would think that Tito had just won the world title. Go watch the finish to that match. You would think he just became WWF champion. The only thing is, his timeline is way off. I mean, that match took place in October of 1991. That was 1 full year earlier. There was no way the WWE was prepping Tito Santana for the possibility of being world champion at the end of 1991, when it was like a month later or something, like a month or 2 later, he started the El Matador gimmick. A few months later, he was curtain jerking at WrestleMania, losing to Shawn Michaels. Ain't no way they were thinking about putting their title on Tito that early. But he has said that, you know, Pat Patterson, to go back to the late 92 stuff, he has said that Pat Patterson told him that it came down to him or Bret. Now, Flair has talked about the match with Bret. He says he hated it. He says he hated the match with Bret. He thought it was one of the worst matches of his career. You know, and maybe he feels that way because he still had the inner ear problem and he knew he was hurt. I think he is being massively hard on that match. I enjoyed it. I thought it was very good. Flair didn't like Bret. He made that very clear in his book. He said he respected him as a wrestler. You know, on the mat, in the ring, he had respect for him, but he thought that he was lacking in every other way. And the feeling was mutual. Bret seemed to hate working with Flair. He thought he was very repetitive, and he hated the chops. Hated the chops. He hated taking the chops, and he just thought that they were dumb. It's very clear that these two, however they talk about each other today, very clear that these two just never liked each other. So in the match, Bret suffered a twisted ankle, dislocated finger. He ended up spending a few hours in the hospital that night. But he was right back in the ring the next night, tagging with the Ultimate Warrior. That match is on the WWE unreleased DVD they put out a few years ago. I have a review of that DVD on YouTube. It's up if you want to search for it and check it out. 23 years ago this week, on October 13th, 1997, Degeneration X was born, kind of. The name Degeneration X was born. Shawn Michaels and Triple H had already been hanging out together on TV for a little while, but it was during a segment on Raw is War. Vince McMahon was in the ring. He was interviewing Bret Hart. He was interviewing the Hart Foundation. They were interrupted by Shawn Michaels, Triple H, Chyna, and Ravishing Rick Rude on the Titantron. And Bret Hart referred to Triple H and Shawn as a couple of degenerates. And that then led to Shawn Michaels talking about how Generation X always gets a bad rap. And from now on, they would be calling themselves Degeneration X. And Michaels also told Bret that he was going to take that stupid piece of tin from him at the Survivor Series. Actually, what he said was he was going to take that stupid piece of tin over your shoulder. And I think the belt was around Bret's waist. So if you needed a giveaway that was a taped segment that Bret was probably interacting with, I have a funny feeling that the Shawn Triple H segment on the Titantron was probably pre-taped. And they were just trying to make sure that they synced it up properly when Bret was responding to them in the ring. But yeah, Michaels called it a stupid piece of tin. He's going to take that stupid piece of tin from him at Survivor Series, which in fact turned out to be true. Always nice to hear one of your top stars refer to your world championship as a stupid piece of tin. I don't know what's more offensive. Shawn Michaels calling the WWF title a stupid piece of tin, or Hulk Hogan when he wrestled that match in '93 in Japan. And he was the champion too. He had the title. And he called it a toy, it's a trinket, it means nothing compared to the IWGP title. And unfortunately, maybe he thought that wouldn't get back to the States, but it's on video. Always nice to hear the champion, right? Talking about his title in that way. But there was an awful lot of drama that unfolded over the next several weeks for a stupid piece of tin. Wouldn't you say? Think of all the drama that could have been avoided if it's just a stupid piece of tin. It's an awful lot of drama for something that he didn't seem to care very much about. 21 years ago this week, on October 17, 1999, WWE held its No Mercy pay-per-view from Cleveland, Ohio. And on that show, Jeff Jarrett defended and lost his Intercontinental Championship to Chyna in a Good Housekeeping match, making Chyna the very first woman, and so far to date the only woman, to ever hold that title. The ring was surrounded by various household objects for them to use as weapons. There was a toilet lid, there was a skillet, even the kitchen sink. But the bigger story was what was going on behind the scenes heading into this match. And look, the significance of this match cannot be overstated. Were it not for this match and what happened behind the scenes, Impact Wrestling would not exist today. There probably would be some other promotion in its place run by somebody else, but Impact Wrestling, which is still alive today, would not exist were it not for this match. There would never have been a TNA Wrestling, because Jeff Jarrett would not have essentially been blackballed from WWE. When WCW went under, he probably would have come back. But the story is this. And Jarrett has told two different versions of this story before, but the main story is this. Jarrett's contract had expired one day before the pay-per-view. How that happens, I have no idea. Jim Ross has talked about it. He was the head of talent relations and said that he takes responsibility. He'll take it on the chin. He takes full responsibility for what happened. It was an oversight. It never should have happened. And not just the fact that this guy had a pay-per-view match and his contract was up the day before. He was a champion. They had a belt on this guy. But Jim Ross has said that he had what he thought was a verbal agreement with Jeff to extend his contract or sign a new contract, but it was a verbal agreement. There was nothing on paper. There was nothing signed and notarized and official. And he showed up at the pay-per-view and made what JR said was a power play. Jarrett says that he only wanted the money that he felt that he was owed by the company. He wanted that money up front before he left, before he would agree to drop the belt to Chyna. It had nothing to do with losing to a woman or anything like that. He technically was no longer under contract. He did not have to do the match. If he didn't want to do it, he could have left. He was not under contract. He would not have been in breach of contract to just get back on a plane and go home before the event. He only wanted what was owed to him. He said there were pay-per-view bonuses that he was owed for June, July, August, and September. They had just done a pay-per-view earlier that month in the UK. I think it was that Rebellion show that had only happened a few weeks before, so obviously he wasn't paid on that show either. You know, these pay-per-view bonuses usually for an event, like I've heard stories about WrestleMania even over the years where you get a big bonus check, let's say, for WrestleMania, but you don't get it that night. You don't get it that week. It could come months later. The famous story with Nails, where he wrestled the match against Virgil at Wembley Stadium at SummerSlam. When he found out how much he got paid for the match, he physically tried to kill Vince McMahon. He went into Vince McMahon's office to confront him about it, but that was a few months after SummerSlam. That was in like December when he found out how much he was getting paid. And he literally put his hands around Vince McMahon's throat and would have choked him to death had other people not heard it and come in and broken him up. So it could be a while. The point is it could be a while before you get that check, and he wanted the money now. He wanted all of that money and money for all the house shows that he was on. He wanted to approximate what he was owed. He didn't have a specific figure because he didn't know how much he was going to get. I've seen the $300,000 figure thrown around. I've seen $400,000 thrown around. Jarrett would only say that he got stock options. The company was about to go public, and they gave him stock options in the company. It's not his fault that the contract expired and that nobody thought to do something about it. Hey, one of our top champions that we booked on this pay-per-view is working without a contract. I'm sure Vince McMahon remembered what happened with Medusa on Nitro a few years earlier. He did not want a repeat of that with the Intercontinental title. So he paid Jarrett what he wanted. He gave him what he wanted. Even if Jarrett didn't take the belt hostage, if he didn't drop it in the ring, it would have taken away from Chyna's big moment. This was the big payoff to their feud. Now, in his book, The Hardcore Truth, great book, by the way, Bob Holly remembers it like this. He saw Jeff Jarrett walk into the building without his gear, no belt, no gear. He walked straight into Vince McMahon's office. And he wanted all of the money that was owed to him, plus money for working the show that night, or he wasn't going to the ring. And he said that he could hear Shane McMahon in there, going crazy, cussing out Jeff Jarrett. He said he was ready to beat the crap out of Jeff, and Shane was usually a very mild-mannered guy. And Vince McMahon said that he would make sure that Jarrett was paid, and Jeff said, no, I want my money wired to my account right now before I go bring my belt and my bag into the building. Otherwise, I'm going back to the airport and I'm going home. And once Jarrett's wife confirmed that the money was in fact wired to their account, that's when he went and brought his stuff in. He got dressed up and he got ready for his match. He said that Bob said that when the match was over, Jeff had been hit during the match with a giant bag of flour, right? Good housekeeping match. So he got hit with a giant bag of flour. And when he came to the back, he had flour all over him. But he just left the building that way. He literally walked to the back. He got his stuff, I guess, walked right to the car, and he went right to the airport. Looking like a redneck version of Tony Montana from Scarface. I'm sure airport security wanted to know, if that was really flour when he got to the security check. This was pre-9/11, so security wasn't as strict maybe as it was a couple of years later. But even still, you get a guy who walks into the airport with powder all over him, you're going to want to pull him aside and ask him a couple of questions. Now, I mentioned that Jarrett has told different versions of what happened. I have not seen this DVD myself, but multiple people who did wrote up reviews about it years ago, and so this is my understanding based on those reviews. Let me just say that. On his King of the Mountain biography DVD that TNA put out many years ago, Jarrett admitted that after making a deal on the money that he was owed that night at No Mercy, like they reached a figure, they reached a dollar amount, he admitted that he went to Jim Ross later on and he doubled the price. And JR felt like he was up against the wall, and so JR agreed to whatever that updated figure was. He agreed to it. I guess the reason that there was heat between them, or at least Jarrett had heat with him, is because long before this, Jim Ross, he was the head of talent relations. He had asked Jarrett to renegotiate his existing contract. And Jarrett had no leverage at the time, and he ended up losing money, or he felt like he lost money because of that. So he was very bitter at Jim Ross about that. And here he saw his chance for some sweet revenge, and so he took it. Which is why he doubled his asking price even after he had already agreed to whatever the original number was. That was his receipt, as they call it, on Jim Ross. But Chyna once floated the idea in her book that Vince Russo and Jarrett were in cahoots on the whole thing, and Russo had Russo had left for WCW a few weeks earlier. He and Jeff were very close. They were very friendly, which is how Russo got his job in TNA. And I guess the idea that she was floating is that Russo intentionally, he was the head writer, he intentionally kept the IC belt on Jarrett longer to where his contract would expire and then he can squeeze Vince for more money. I don't buy that. I mean, that's a conspiracy theory that she floated. I don't buy that. But it was a very sordid tale that resulted in Jeff Jarrett being blackballed for many, 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 many years from WWE and led to the eventual rise of TNA wrestling. 11 years ago this week, on October 16, 2009, came the shocking announcement that Shane McMahon was resigning from World Wrestling Entertainment. He announced in a note published on WWE.com, "It is with great sadness that I announce my resignation from the WWE effective January 1st, 2010. I have never even considered a future outside the walls of WWE. However, sometimes life takes an unexpected turn. And while it is the most difficult decision I have ever made, it is time for me to move on." Now, he later said that he left to pursue other ventures and spend more time with his kids. That's what everybody says, right? Politician, if there's a scandal, they try to head it off by saying, "Oh, I'm just resigning because I want to spend more time with my family." That's always the go-to excuse. And hey, look, I'm sure Shane loves his kids. And maybe he was working crazy hours, and maybe his wife was on board and said, "Yeah, it would be nice to have you home more often." But no 40-year-old man, or I think he may have been 39 at the time, so basically 40, okay? Still a relatively young guy. No 40-year-old man is just going to up and quit his job like that without there being some other reason involved. I'm sorry. I don't care how much he loves his kids. That ain't the only reason he walked away. And when he came back in 2016, and he sat down on the network for that sit-down interview with Mick Foley, because I guess Steve Austin had a previous commitment, so they had Foley do the interview, he admitted what the real reason was. His father had rejected a lot of his ideas, and it frustrated him greatly. It greatly frustrated him, and after a while, he said it wasn't fun anymore. He said, "I think with any parent and child relationship, it's tough, especially with the older guard allowing the new guard to flesh those ideas out and try them, to go for it, because they're so guarded against it. No, he wasn't open to my ideas, and what grew out of that, it stopped being a collaboration, and it stopped being fun. And when that happened," he says, "the WWE defines my father, and I was not going to allow a deteriorating business relationship to affect our personal relationship, our personal lives," and that's exactly what was happening. "So I decided, you know what? I'm not going to do this. I love him too much. And I decided to leave." Now, I know at one point Shane wanted to buy Pride Fighting Championships, and Vince said no. There's the story of him wanting to revive the old ECW. This was before WWE did, and they put it on Sci-Fi. Paul Heyman talked about this. Shane wanted to restart ECW as an online-only promotion with no restrictions that you would have if it was on television. So it could be either the ECW of old or something close to what the old ECW was. But he would run it as a developmental league, similar to what NXT is today. And that was rejected. I know he met with Dana White many years later about possibly buying the UFC. I think that may have been right after he left WWE, though. But I mean, look, there's more than one example of Shane wanting to do things that his father shot down. And maybe Vince was right. I'm not saying Vince was right or wrong here. Maybe Vince McMahon had good reason. Maybe Vince McMahon had good business reasons to say no to his son's ideas. Maybe Shane would have flopped. But he never got the chance, and that clearly bothered him. I mean, how could it not? I also think, and this is just me talking now, I think he finally realized, I think he finally realized he wasn't going to be the heir apparent. That was going to be Triple H and Stephanie. And that, coupled with his father being difficult to work with, is why he finally split. If Shane McMahon thought that he was next in line to run WWE and all he had to do is just tolerate his father, I know I'm next in line, or I'm going to take over, or there's a succession plan in place, if he knew that, there's no way he would have left. There's no way he would have stepped away. I don't believe that for a second. I think he saw the writing on the wall. Jim Ross said that one time he was talking to Vince McMahon, they were having a conversation, and Vince told him, he goes, he loves both of his kids. But he says Vince told him the girl is more like me than the boy. And I think that says a lot. Shane eventually came back now. He's part of the company again. Triple H, he has a big role still in the company, but it's not a lock that, Paul Levesque is going to take over when Vince McMahon dies. It's not a sure thing. It could end up in the hands of some other executive that they brought into the company. George Barrios isn't there anymore, but they've brought other people in. I still feel like if Vince has a good deal one day, I could see him selling to Disney for billions of dollars. So it's not a guarantee that it's going to stay in the family and that Triple H is one day going to be the new Vince McMahon. That is not a surefire thing. But clearly, he saw more of himself and that killer instinct in Stephanie than he saw in Shane. I've always been intrigued by the whole thing, right? You got to think that Shane thought this was all going to be his until Triple H married into the family. How could that not create some tension? It's why I wanted a Triple H Shane McMahon WrestleMania match when Shane came back. I didn't care about Shane McMahon and The Undertaker. The money match is Shane and Triple H because of the story. It's a natural story, the natural drama. Even if everything is all great between the two of them, it would be such an easy story to buy into. They could do it like a work shoot and fool people. Fine. But it would have been such an easy story to tell. I don't know how good the match would have been. I'm sure Shane would have taken some kind of crazy bump. But it would have been such a believable story. The drama, just the build up to the match itself would have been better. The build would have been better maybe than the match. Some of those promos and bringing family business into it and just kind of talking about this stuff. That's what I wanted to see. Inject a little bit of reality into that story and just let it all play out on TV, but they never did. 10 years ago this week, on October 18, 2010, saw the launch of the Stand Up for WWE campaign. So a little history here. 1 year earlier, Linda McMahon stepped down as the CEO of WWE. She stepped down because she was running for a United States Senate seat in the state of Connecticut. She was going to be running for the seat the following year, in 2010. In so doing, she opened herself up to a lot of criticism of her and her husband and some of the controversies that had dogged them in the company for many, many years, which frankly was fair game because she was the CEO. So she had to know that that was going to happen. It's not like Linda was in the shadows. It's not fair to bring all of this up. It's Vince McMahon's company. Linda McMahon was the CEO. That company was every bit as much hers as it was Vince McMahon's. And frankly, there were a few stories that I won't get into. I've told them before with the Zahorian stuff, Dr. Zahorian, the phone call from a payphone, with her and Pat Patterson. Linda McMahon did some things that saved that company's ass. So she is as much a part of the history of that company as anybody. So her opponent brought up the issue of steroids and concussions and their treatment of talent, the whole independent contractor farce. Lance Cade dying a few months before didn't help matters. And all of this very much angered Vince McMahon, who supposedly, without any knowledge of Linda's campaign, wink wink, supposedly they had no idea, he started this new movement called Stand Up for WWE, where he himself personally, on video, encouraged WWE fans to write in on social media and say positive, glowing things about the company and how I grew up watching WWE. I love WWE. I'm such a big WWE fan. All of this stuff. And things got really nasty because her opponent's campaign accused them of colluding with WWE, and it was a whole mess. But Vince McMahon felt personally attacked. And when he feels personally attacked, he is going to want to respond. He wanted to respond and set the record straight. In the end, Linda spent $50 million of her own money and she lost. And then in 2012, when she ran again, she spent another $50 million of her own. Well, it was her and Vince's money. It was also Vince McMahon's money. And she lost again. So she has the great distinction of spending $100 million on 2 Senate seats and having absolutely nothing to show for it. If only Vince McMahon had stood up for his bank account. 9 years ago this week, on October 16, 2011, gave us the greatest tweet in the history of Twitter, immortalized forever by the immortal one himself, Hulk Hogan, who tweeted this out at 1 o'clock in the morning. Good night, Hulkamaniacs and jabroni marks without a life that don't know it a work when you work a work and work yourself into a shoot, marks. They put Archie Bunker's chair in the Smithsonian. I think they should do the same thing with this tweet. That's where it belongs. In fact, someone, as a gift, once sent me a framed photo of this tweet, and I still have it proudly in my possession. What it actually means doesn't matter. Just appreciate it for what it is. Now, later that night, TNA held its Bound for Glory pay-per-view, which saw Hogan wrestle what is still the last big match of his career, a loss to Sting that saw Hogan hulk up and turn babyface after the match and come to Sting's rescue against Immortal. It isn't technically his last match. He came out to wrestle in a tag match unannounced on a TNA house show in the UK a few months later, and I think there was another tag match later on. I don't count that one because he never actually wrestled. He got beat up backstage, although he was technically part of the match, but he didn't actually work the match. I could see why he wants his final match to be in WWE, but at 67 years old, after 10 or 11 now back surgeries, I think that window has closed. I think the tweet may have been in reference or in response to rumors that were going around about the show that night and him not wanting Bobby Roode to win the TNA World Heavyweight title, which may have been the original plan. It was Roode challenging Kurt Angle for the championship later that night. I do remember people groaning when Angle pinned him. I remember groaning myself when Angle pinned him. People thought that was going to be the big crowning moment for Bobby Roode. And I think Hogan got the finish changed. He didn't think that Roode was the guy. He isn't the guy, brother. Either that or he didn't want Roode's title win to upstage his big babyface turn. You make the call. Or maybe I'm just a jabroni mark, working a work and working myself into a shoot. But looking back, Hogan was right. As a babyface, Rude was not the guy. Rude turned heel a few weeks later and probably had he had a better run. I'm sure he had a better run as a heel champion. He did win the belt, but as a heel than he would have had as a babyface. See, Hogan might be looking out for himself a lot, but he's no dummy when it comes to the wrestling business. He knows the business. He's not always right, but I think he got it right in that situation. And 6 years ago this week, on October 13th, 2014, Hiroshi Tanahashi made history in New Japan when he captured the IWGP Championship for a record 7th time, beating AJ Styles at their King of Pro Wrestling show in Tokyo. AJ had arrived in New Japan earlier that year. He attacked the champion Okada on his very first night in, and then he beat Okada in his very first match to win the IWGP title. I think a lot of people were expecting AJ to drop the belt to Okada at the Tokyo Dome at Wrestle Kingdom. So Tanahashi winning here was something of a surprise, and Tanahashi would go on to beat Okada at Wrestle Kingdom instead. His second time doing so at the Tokyo Dome in the main event. Okada would finally win one over Tanahashi the following year. Now that is long-term storytelling.